Okay, so this is where we get to like something that's like really confusing, but like this is where things kind of take a dive, and you really have to just kind of look at both these stuff and try to sort this out. This whole thing gets confusing. But anyways, okay, so when Gen 2 came out, there was a lot of different designs that were done, but it still maintained, like, if you actually play the Space World Odyssey, or the Space Odyssey, Space World 1997 and 1998 demo of Pokemon, and look at the data, they say that 251 Pokemon are in that Dexter. However, though, what's really interesting, though, is at this point in time, you can see that some of it was actually supposed to be more, believe it or not, because you had the original 251, and then there were some Pokemon that were kind of cut out and scrapped, and they weren't added in yet. So this because it's still beta. But then by the time they finalized it, they took out some of the Pokemon and put other ones in. So they still agreed that 251 was the number they wanted. But it's worth noting. It's worth noting that there was more than 251. Okay, so if you're wondering, well, what Pokemon were removed and what Pokemon were placed in, good example, compare the Pokedex 251 in the final release games compared to the beta. And you'll have to like really look on the internet with what Pokemon were removed, the ones that were. This is where it kind of gets confusing. You have to figure out which ones were scrapped, removed entirely, or scrapped but like put in with something or replaced. Basically, you're trying to figure out which ones were replaced. If you could figure out those numbers, you could figure out how many Pokemon were originally supposed to be in 251 or Gen 2 and Gen 1. And it might be very possible that most of these Pokemon were actually supposed to be cut off from Gen 1's 190. Or maybe these were the original 251 that were supposed to be in Gen 1, but then they added more and then more, you know. It's interesting, because Gen 1, they probably wanted to add more, but they had a cutoff date, and then Gen 2 came out, and then they had the cutoff date. So I would not be surprised in the slightest. But we definitely have proof right here that some of these Pokemon were either removed and delayed to a later game, like Gen 2 to Gen 4. A good example, Leafeon and I believe Licky Licky were actually a couple examples, just to name a few, because it's going to get really confused. And then you have Pokemon that were in the beta that were scrapped entirely, that I've never even seen before, that weren't redesigns of something else. It was something completely different. And then we find out that it was never to be seen again. Like, so it was entirely, it almost made it into the final release, but whatever it was, well, I'm sure it would have had a fan base of somebody, but, you know. So, it's worth noting that some of these Pokemon, like, while we haven't seen them before, it's very possible that a lot of these Pokemon are indeed beta designs. That, because again, if it's a series that a lot of people have played that nobody's played it, like, seen them, then these designs have to exist somehow, one way or another. So we can also conclude that the Pokemon games also, like, they, with the beta designs, they probably redid all the original sprites again too. So, you know, they had to do like the original 251, and it's crazy to think how many Pokemon they like. One that really got me was, I always thought Celebi was very interesting. Celebi was supposed to, like, before it had its wings, before it had its cute little smile, before it was all green, it was like a forest guardian pixie that it played a flute instead. It kind of looked like a leprechaun sort of, but in a fairy type way. It's kind of hard to describe. You can see what its beta design looks like. It's really interesting how they got this. I can see why they would say Celebi is more fitting for the guardian of the forest while it time travels, while not being as strong as like Dialga as far as the creator of time in the Pokemon universe, and maybe Arcturus too, if you want to argue that as well. But you know, Celebi has enough of the ability to time travel, so it brings, every time it goes into the future and comes back, it brings an egg from the future, which is really cool. So it's fitting to be a guardian of the forest, or the it starts with an I, Elex Forest, the one that's outside of Azalea Town, just before you had to cross it in order to get to Goldenrod City, where Whitney is the gym leader. So you go from Azalea Town to Goldenrod City, and I think Bugsy is the second gym leader, just before you get out of Rock Tunnel, and or Dark Cave. No, not Dark Cave. What's the one before to go from? You go south of Violet City, where Faulkner is the gym leader, down to. You go through a route of trainers, and then you eventually hit a cave, and then you hit Azalea Town. But anyways, so we have. Let's see here. We have a bunch of Pokemon that were scrapped. We have a bunch of. And what's really interesting is, like I said before in a previous video, there is, like, Gen 2 was actually supposed to be a lot bigger. It's very possible that if Pokemon really was supposed to be a lot, like Gen 1 and Gen 2, Gen 1 was probably supposed to be one game, and then they decided, oh, hey, well, we'll make a sequel. And it was probably supposed to have even more stuff in it. So, again, both games... So it's kind of like this. This is what I've concluded with Gen 1 and 2. If Gen 1 and Gen 2 were supposed to be like their own games, but instead it seems like what we got instead was Gen 1 was its own game, but then Gen 2 was just a direct sequel with more content that they couldn't fit into Gen 1 due to cutoff dates, and maybe they weren't sure they wanted, like maybe they changed their mind about some of the stuff later on. I would imagine that what ended up happening was Gen 1 was supposed to be with Gen 2. And reasons for this is because, you know, you had Pokemon, you got to think of it like this. Gen 1, Pokemon had, because there was a lot of ideas that they changed. Okay, so like let's take Lugia, for example. Okay, Lugia was supposed to be in Gen 1. And what had happened was, and so was Ho-Oh, believe it or not. Gen 1, we were supposed to find out that if you caught Articuno, Zapdos, and Moltres, okay, those are the sub-legendaries, and their master legendary that they guard is Lugia. Lugia is the creator of the seas. Okay, so if assuming that these Pokemon still had the same final roles that we come to know them as, like, for example, we catch, you know, but why is it that, like, Lugia and Ho-Oh are in the Johto region, for example? Why are they... I mean, Johto is still part of Japan, and if you don't know, the world maps are based on areas in real world life. Kanto is Gen 1, but it takes place in Japan. So it's just a different population. See, now, I'll give you a little more backstory, okay? It gets a little confusing, but it kind of explains why, like, if you ever play Pokemon Fire Red and Leaf Green in Gen 3, you know, even though the remakes of Gen 1 and 2. How is it that when you go to the Kanto region, or, you know, and you have, like, the Johto remixes, like, for example, like, you go to the Sebi Islands, how is it that they are still within the Johto region, but it's, like, in the Kanto region, though? So, it kind of got confusing, because some people would often ask, well, they're like, well, you know, what's with all the Johto influences in the Kanto region? Well, actually, it's just that, you know, they're two different entirely regions, but they're still part of the same land. In this case, it would be Japan. So it's really interesting to think that for a Pokemon game that, you know, they had exchanging cultural differences, but they were still part of the same main land in the same area. So it really was, they might have been two different places, but they were still one of the same. Two sides of the same coin, rather. And so I believe that if Pokemon Gen 1 was supposed to be all one game, because again, these Pokemon were supposed to be in Gen 1, it's very possible that Gen 1 could have been a lot longer of a game. Even judging by the beta map still looked the same, but it's very possible that they wanted to put Gen 2 in Gen 1. And so we would just go to another part of, because again, there were so many beta maps that very well could have changed too. And, I mean, because Pokemon was supposed to be a big game when it came out. Like, but what the creator's saying that they weren't really sure they wanted to make a second game after all that. But basically what led them to want to make the second game was that it was supposed to be in Gen 1. You know, there was a lot of scrapped ideas. There was, you know what I mean? But there's so many things that still answer so many questions, though. Like what, you know, like all the beta designs they found, like the imposter, you know, and this, like this would make a lot of sense. Like, you had the imposter oak, for example. And if you play Gen 2, they recycled that into Gen 2, where, you know, rather than it being Professor Oak, who was the evil one, it was just somebody who was claiming to be Giovanni, you know, when the Rockets... So, for example, in Gen 2, the final release, you had, like, the Rockets attacking the radio tower right after they, you know, because they wanted their revenge after they couldn't overtake the secret base. Well, like when you team up with Lance at like Rage, you know, you stop the radio tower from being overtaken later on, and you know, because you stop them in the Slowpoke Well in Azalea Town. Then later on, you go to Mahogany Town and you team up with Lance to go into their underground base and figure out how to make all the you know, transmitting all the weird radio signals that they're having. And then they go and hijack the whole radio tower itself, and you overtake that. They fight them to the death almost. You overthrow that, save the radio tower after you save the executive, and then you get the card key, and then you go to the final part of the radio tower and you fight them right to the death. And then you basically tell them to get out of here because, you know, they basically forfeit. They couldn't beat you, so then they leave. And then the radio tower's saved. And then after that, we really don't see Team Rocket again. After even Giovanni's nowhere to be found, but at least in the final releases of the game. Now, where is Giovanni? Well, I mean, unless you count like the Rainbow Rocket episode from Gen 7 and Ultra Moon and Ultra Sun. But those were all data holograms, like, you know, created through, trying to remember. But whatever happened to the real rockets and all that, it's quite interesting. Giovanni's nowhere to be found. Silver was his son, you know, the one that your rival in Gen 2. And so it's really interesting to think, like, how much different would those games would have been, though, because if all the ideas, because here's what I'm looking at. If the games really were longer, which I do believe, more of the beta designs would have been used. And if they would have made a sequel to Gen 2, then Gen 2 would have been significantly different than Gen 1. In the sense that, like, if they would have took all the ideas, if Gen 1 was Gen 2 and Gen 1 and Gen 2 as far as like all the ideas they wanted to use, it's very possible that when they would have made Gen 2 again, it would have been even longer. Both of these games would have been a lot longer if they wouldn't have had a cutoff date to begin with, is basically what I'm saying. But again, this is where it gets confusing, because how much different would it have been? You see what a whole you see like how time and you know, decision making can really make for a different product. Pokemon's already a very long series to begin with, but it just seems like the more ideas they put into it, you really got to ask yourself how much different could have been. And I honestly think it's a great series, even in its final form. Music's great, stories usually get you thinking. And you know what? It really served its purpose as a series. You know, what was always about adventure. Always about going out, trying to find things. Even me, for example, would be like questioning the meaning of life. And the easiest way to answer that is to go see it for yourself. Kind of like in Sora, you know, if you remember Kingdom Hearts, you know, like when he was telling, like when they were joking around about the fruit and how their destinies would be intertwined. You know, before that, you know, they were sitting there wondering about like all the worlds that are out there, all the other worlds, when they're stuck on Destiny Islands. And Sora's like, I want to go see them all, you know. He was wondering, he was telling that to Riku when they were sitting there watching the sunset, and I think it was before Kairi showed up. It was either before or after. She might have been there with them, but it's before he goes to Traverse Town, or Traveler's Town, and meets up with Donald and Goofy for the very first time. And it's interesting, like how, you know, one game an adventure begins as time goes on. It's really cool, actually. Very interesting indeed. How a bunch of games can really bring a lot of people together. And, you know, it kind of reminds me of like a quote with Tom Petty. You know, he basically stated back in the day that music is the greatest thing we have to real life magic. And he wouldn't be wrong, because, you know, imagination is like the closest thing we have to bringing our dreams to reality. You know, Pokemon was an idea that was created by a guy who wanted to make his dreams come true. And after he found out that how he wanted to do it, all he needed was a team of people, because programming isn't easy. And they managed to overcome the odds. They needed money too, budget wise. But it was really interesting. They ended up making like one of the most complex games Nintendo had ever seen. And if it wasn't for people like Shigeru Miyamoto backing them, like they might have never actually been able to. Like at one point it was denied, and then they made another game called Yoshi's Cookie, because at this point Shigeru Miyamoto was like one of the higher ups. And So what he did was he gave them another chance. He convinced them. And when Yoshi's Cookie actually made a lot of money, they had a lot more money to finish the game. So when Pokemon was made, it basically, the 151 that we know it as in 1995, Pokemon Green was made, and then they started releasing, Pokemon Green and Red came out first, and then the versions we got were actually the 1.1 version of Pokemon Blue and all that. And it's quite interesting. It really is. Like, if you have to like really compare the regional differences, but once again, it's like you really see like how different all these games can be. Pokemon is no exception. It's just one of the many possibilities that garners like it's a series that begs answers that we don't have. Like how many ideas changed and how many different things. Because again, I've played those games for years, and even to this day, I still learn new things. And hopefully, I can teach you when I find more